I'd like to, can you put that slide up? In February of this year, National Institutes of Health, NIH, hosted a meeting called SCI 2020, and you can read right there. The goal of the SCI 2020, launching a decade of disruption in spinal cord injury research conference, is to initiate discussion across the SCI research community to launch a new decade of research that disrupts traditional barriers, brings about collaborative efforts to address the key research questions in spinal cord injury research. We felt like it was going to be very important to have at least a follow-up conversation to that meeting. So there were several hundred people at the NIH Institute in DC, or wherever that is. Is it Maryland, Virginia? I never understand where I am when I'm there. It was an interesting meeting and somewhat challenging. The North American SCI Consortium, of which I'm a member, a delegate member, were invited to take the piece about the SCI community, this idea of with us, not for us. And we wanted to have a conversation from the community perspective to challenge the research and clinical community. Can you go to the next? And I just wanted to give you this really brief frame right there, because this is the origin of this conversation. From that meeting and from the many, many conversations that were had after, both with NASCIC and at U2FP and with many scientists and clinicians, was this sort of realization that, and obviously you could take the regulatory and payer maybe out of the equation. They were here yesterday. But the idea was that these are the main sort of stakeholder, big bucket groups involved in this whole effort, this whole enterprise. And the idea is that, and the SCI community is in that sort of, we're in a strange, like, we're the stakeholder, but we're also the target. It's us that people are researching, or our injuries. And so everyone's sort of pointing at their own target. They have a way that they define success. And I've come to believe that advocacy, and you can hit the next, is really that. Our role as advocates is to intercede amongst the various stakeholders, to be sort of a go-between, a player that's asking you, what do you need to get a win? What do you need to discover what you need to discover? What do you need to fund? What do you need to bring to, how are you going to get something to market, et cetera, et cetera? And so that everybody can win. Because if everybody doesn't win, then we don't win. We don't get a win. You discover something, kind of like yesterday. You discover the magic bullet, but it doesn't get paid for, and it doesn't get through the regulatory process. So what? You saw the panel yesterday of people who had amazing changes, from small changes that have huge impact. And some of those things are still not, I can't tell my son to go home and call his doctor and get it prescribed. So how do we get a win? And so we wanted to have a conversation with people that represent those stakeholder groups so that we can all get that, which is the win. So that'll be our conversation that we'll start having, and then, of course, we'll introduce the room so that we can start having a larger conversation. But before, Kim Eisner is going to say a few words.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you. So I am Kim Eisner, and I am the executive director of the Craig H. Neilsen Foundation. And we are fortunate that you've heard our names a couple of times over the last few days. So before I get to the point that Matthew has raised, I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to thank Craig H. Neilsen. Craig was an incredible man. He was driving home from a work site late one night, 1985, and was in a car accident. And he suffered a high injury and had little use of his left hand, and that was it. He was a businessman before the accident, but he built his empire after. His tenacity inspires me. I think about it a lot, and I want to share it with you because you may not have ever heard of the Craig H. Neilsen before the last couple days. Maybe you have, but you don't know who he is or who he was. That's who he was, and that spirit of, okay, now we've done something, now let's do something more. Okay, that was good, we accomplished, let's do something more. That's who he was, and that's how we try to drive our work. And the other organization I would need to thank would be NIH for doing the conference. It was something they hadn't done in a long time, and it brought about a lot of good conversation. Matthew was very kind. He invited me to sit on this panel, but I said no. I should have said yes. I would have diversified it a little bit.
You did say yes, then you said no.
I said maybe, and then I said no. Because I don't believe, one funder's perspective, but I think many of my colleagues would agree that a funder is a stakeholder. I don't want to ever be in a position to drive an agenda. I want to hear from you what you need, and then we'll try to find a way and a mechanism to support that. When people write grants that are trying to meet my needs, we can usually see right through it. You tell us what you need, and we'll listen. And then we try to find a way to create a mechanism. Now, I can imagine sitting there hearing that and thinking, yeah, right, you're going to listen. So glad you're involved. I've been in both places. Let me give you a couple really quick examples of how funders might listen, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to talk about what they think post-conference, how I can hear, how we've been hearing the last couple days, and we'll see what's next. Collaboration is key. You've been hearing it throughout the whole last 2 days, but it's key. In 2015, we started hearing a lot about bowel and bladder and sexual function. It was really important to the community. There wasn't a lot of research being done. So we started. What's going on? What's out there? What's not? 2017, we held a think tank. Clinicians, people with SCI, researchers. What are the priorities? How do we articulate them? 5 priorities were articulated. There's been a couple papers written. Clinical care practice for bowel is being rewritten. And we didn't have a mechanism to support everything that needed to happen from our perspective to support your needs in terms of bowel and bladder care. So we put out our first ever request for information, RFA application. See, I'm not a scientist, the whole acronym thing. So for those of you that have had problems with that the last couple days, I feel you. We decided to do this open-ended request because we didn't have a mechanism, but that didn't mean it wasn't important. Last month, we announced, or we awarded 6 grants. 5 for bladder, 1 for bowel, and I don't know what's going to come from it, but I'll tell you what we included in that process that we've never done before. Translation plan over the next 10 years was mandated, because that's what we keep hearing. We didn't require, but we encouraged including people in their research team with a spinal cord injury, and we expected cross-disciplinary expertise. We didn't just want a list of names of people that they're going to collaborate with. We tried to really enforce that a little bit more in our application process. So we're listening and we're hearing. We're doing our best. I know, having a conversation with Kim and Jen and Barry this morning, we want it now. We want it fast. We are working as a funder as fast as we can. And just know we want it done well. We want it done safely. And we want to make sure that whatever the it is, it supports your needs. And then the last thing I would say is I know following SCI 2020 conference, NIH put out a request for information. There you go, my brain. And they got over 170 responses. because they want to know from the community, following those 2.5 days, what do you need? How can we respond? And then how can we encourage or incorporate that into some of our mechanisms, meaning NIH? So we are listening. You are to drive the agenda, and we will do our very best in terms of our missions and our values and all the different things as funders to support what you're doing. And so thank you for your work. Thank you for being vulnerable. Thank you for your passion. And I'll look forward to see what's going to come over the next couple of hours, couple of days, couple of years. But thank you for letting me be here.
Thanks, Kim. Well, let's quickly just go down the line, just so you know who everybody is. Some I think you already, because you need that. We'll get them all out.
Hi, I'm Michael Lane from Drexel University, and I'm representing the preclinical researchers.
Yes, hello, my name is Ernest Wong. I'm the CEO of Neurgen, and I'm representing industry.
My name is Matthew Bellman. I'm the founder and chief technology officer of Myelin, also representing industry, but from the device side.
And I'm David Darrow, representing the clinical side.
I'm Barry Munro, and I'm representing the organizations and the people with lived experience.
Thank you. Well, let's just jump right into, and I'll just start with you, Michael, even what we were talking about earlier, just to kick off the conversation. Maybe you could describe, I'm going to throw you an open-ended one. You could take it wherever you want. Let's say tomorrow you make a grand discovery in your lab, and you have to make some decisions now about what do you do with that discovery. And let's oversimplify and say it's something worth pushing out, a discovery that it might be meaningful for people in this room. Who do you go to? Who do you look to hand off to? And then maybe from that conversation, like Ernest or I mean, any of us could ask, well, what, and maybe more specifically, sorry, Ernest, what would you need to say yes to that, to say, I will take that? I'll take the baton. We talked about a relay race. I'll take the baton and take it to the next handoff.
So I think, firstly, I'm going to use some words in my answer that probably aren't always interpreted in the same way. I think when you talk about me pushing it forward, you're referring to translation, which is a word that's probably interpreted differently by everyone on the panel. But if I was to have something that I did want to move forward into something that could become conventional use for people with spinal cord injury, then I think we need to have the level of communication that's being pushed from things like the SCI 2020 discussion, where for the first time that I've seen, this very diverse audience was there, not only there to communicate what they think and what they believe in, but to also listen. And I think that having the power to listen to everything that's being said was very important in that ongoing discussion. So when I decide who I'm going to move to next, who I'm going to translate to, if you like, outside of my preclinical research, it becomes educational to speak to everybody that's here. So technically I should be consulting with people with spinal cord injury to make sure first that this is something that's relevant. I should speak to clinicians to see if this is something that could be viable. Would they be willing to take this on? I speak to industry to see if they could support the translation from a fiscal and logistical standpoint into something that could become a therapy that they could develop. So there's many different parts of that translational spectrum, if you like, which need to be better understood. When we first started this discussion, we talked about there being barriers, and obviously the SCI 2020 is to disrupt traditional barriers. I think perhaps one of the biggest barriers was that many of us haven't had a strong appreciation or knowledge for what the barriers that these other groups have, not just our barriers, but what barriers you might face. I have been oblivious to, and that's what I think we need to better communicate.
Great. Hello? There we go. Okay. So actually, this is a interesting question because I think you just described the NerveGen experience, in my experience in the last year and a half. But for NerveGen, which was in formation for over 3 years, that's exactly what happens. I mean, in that case, it was Dr. Jerry Silver's technology that actually was brought forth by one of our co-founder, Dr. Harold Pundit, whose daughter-in-law did suffer a spinal cord injury, and he's actually a dentist, but he went out of his way to look for something to try to help. Now, aside from all the scientific questions that I'll let my other colleagues comment on, and also really just, making sure that there's scientific diligence, that there's, the science is valid, the data is valid, it could be useful in the clinic, and all that stuff. I will comment on the point of now, as a CEO or as a group of business founders, they have to, at the end of the day, go out and convince a group of investors. And these are people that are not necessarily foundations or necessarily have a vested interest in the injury. So Dr. Pundit, actually, who is a major investor, did have a personal interest in the technology. But my job is to go out to investors to ask them for millions of dollars to invest something that in our company, in our dream, in our technology, and convince them to invest in this versus sinking a oil well, right? I mean, there's a lot of things these people can invest in. So when these things comes up, aside from all the scientific diligence to make sure that everything is as valid as it can, my job is to make sure that there's a story there that I could take to New York, take to bankers, take to investors, and convince them to invest their money in this. And sometimes I may have to think of some other things that's not necessarily, for example, spinal cord injury, that resonates with them. But again, my role is to really build out the story, build out the technology, and go out and convince these folks to invest in the dream. And then work with everyone across all the functional area to make it happen.
So Ernest nailed a lot of points on the head there. I guess the only thing that I can add from a device perspective is when I'm looking at, a little bit of background. So I have a PhD in mechanical engineering, and my research was on FES. And when I was doing that research, I had a fear that the benefits of what I was developing wouldn't make it to the people who needed it. And so that's why that was a big motivator for me to start Myelin and to do that translation myself, because I wasn't expecting that anybody else could, would, should do it. So I have a little bit of a unique translation story there because I did that first step myself. But now I'm in a position where I can look at other technologies and devices that are being developed in people's labs and in people's clinics and see potential for technology to make it out there and make a difference in people's lives. And one of the biggest things for me when I'm looking at these technologies and criteria for do we want to undertake the tremendous effort of bringing this to market, the first question is, does it actually meet a need? So really understanding customer needs, the needs of the community, that's the most important thing by far. And then beyond that, it's math, and it's technically simple math, but it doesn't actually work out to be that easy to do in the long run. And that's, we're companies, we're selling products, we're selling devices, we're selling therapies, so we need to have assurance that somebody will pay X amount for it and that we can produce it for some value less than that when you account for everything, including the cost of running the business. And as long as that equation has enough of a buffer there, then we can make it happen and try to grow to the point where we can bring out more technologies. And that's, where our company is heading, and I think where ultimately a lot of device companies are trying to go and should go, is building up to the point where we have the resources, we can then start to reach into these labs and clinics and bring this stuff out where it can actually benefit people. And then, sometimes that means raising lots of money, and that's tough.
Yeah, maybe if I could just add one point. So, whether it's a device or a therapy, it takes millions and millions of dollars to do this. When you go and talk to people, investors, the bankers, the high net worth individual, they're sympathetic, okay? But bottom line, at the end of the day, they want a return on their money. And they want to know when and how much. So all of this stuff is part of the story. You start pitching to them, the need, of course, the benefits that you could potentially bring. But at the end of the day, it boils down to, I'm giving you $10 million. I give you $50 million. When do I get it back? And how much do I get it back? And that's just the reality that I think industry, has to deal with, because that's, like I said, they can take that $50 million and write a computer code, and become, I don't know, name your favorite software company.
The secret is be rich enough to do it yourself.
or know Bill Gates. Anybody know Bill Gates?
So I'm curious if, any of you describe a specific category of barriers that you need to overcome. I know, even over the course of the last 2 days, we talked briefly about CMS and the challenges that you, with having a company that you do have, the challenges that you're faced with payers. We talked earlier today in the cell portion about I think I made the point of how big is small relative to what you're talking about, in what kind of expectation does an investor have from a new therapy, what kind of market potential and splash, and if we're looking at something that maybe is more modest. And then as a researcher, or you researchers, how does that inform what you're doing, both in humans and in animals or dishes? Like how do those barriers get defined by each of you? And back to your original point of translation, something that came up at the 2020 meeting is that people are using words differently and define them differently, and especially when it comes to communicating between the science and the SCI community. So I don't know if you can distill that down for each of you. Like what's a primary barrier that you want to remove, or that you feel like you need to address?
Well, that's interesting, because that's really where the role of the community, being people with lived experience, I think slide right in. And before this, you've offered the opportunity to come up here and talk. I thought, I was thinking, what is our role? There's a lot of roles, and it really touches on everything. For example, and just back to what you said, funding, for example. Well, that takes advocacy and, frankly, speaking to Congress and changing the law. And but this really goes back to ourselves in here as a community. I think of the different conversations I've had this weekend and the conversations I've had over the years, and the same ones. And one thing that was interesting, the conversation I had with one individual, and he said, we referred to, well, what are they going to do about it? We're they. We are they. And we got to figure that one out and decide now that we are they. They aren't going to do anything for us. We are they. We have to be able to tell the basic scientists that this is the direction, or this is the priority of what we want done. We have to be able to advocate to the funders, including Congress, and say, we need more money in this direction and we need to get there quicker because people are dying. There is an urgency. We need to talk and find mechanisms in private industry where it makes sense, and particularly with scientists. I learned with an engineer a long time ago that in engineering school, the one thing they forget to teach them, and they work on going back and looking at it, is talk to the end user before you start working on the product that you're about to build, not after you built it. Because then they're going to look at it, that's great, but it doesn't help me. We are they, and then right to the safety of it. And someone like Dr. Darrow has got to put the brakes on and said, that's great, Barry, you're passionate, you're excited, but I could kill you. And that's important because then there's no more they. But, we looked at what the AIDS community went with. They pushed so hard with FDA and got so many things approved that some of it was kind of dicey at the end, and maybe they were too aggressive and too passionate and too good at what they did. But the point being is that we have to shape the conversation, we have to organize, and we have to educate ourselves. And at 2020, and I want to speak a bit about 2020 because we caused a bit of a ripple. There was some disruption, but there was no intent to basically say to the scientists that have been working in this field for 30 and 40 years that what they were doing is wrong. What we were saying is the system isn't working in our favor, and it's not their fault, but we're not getting to where we need to be the way it's going right now. We need to disrupt it and make it different. And we didn't necessarily have the answers, but that was the voice of the community. So they said, we need to make some changes. And just by doing this right now, and I want to say it's great that, how often do you have all of these representatives literally sitting at the same table talking like this? Not very often. And it's not often enough. The one last thing I wanted to mention was, and we've mentioned this at 2020, the one dialogue that has to happen from the basic researchers and into the clinicians and into private industry is the dialogue with individuals who will basically tell you that sometimes there's what we call low-hanging fruit. There are things out there that could be brought to market very quickly that will help us. And I think when you talk about electrical stim and neuromodulation, in the early days, everybody was looking at as a win would be walking. But imagine getting bowel and bladder control back. The outside world doesn't really understand that conversation, but they do. And they say we need that, and that would be a major win and would bring us all together and be a big score for our community and an incremental step in finding a way to help things out. So that's the role of the community, and frankly, unfortunately, it's work, and we got to roll up our sleeves, but we got to stop blaming the industry and the scientists and all those people with all the goodwill in this space. We have to take responsibility and frankly help them with their jobs.
David, name one disruption you need to win.
I think one of the things I was thinking about listening to this very complex conversation is I want to give something specific, Of course, we all have to be at the table, and we should all communicate, and But there are very practical elements to that make it challenging, and that's why, that's why we're not all usually at the table. Whenever I see a patient in clinic that's not in one of my research protocols, it pains me because I know that everything that patient has gone through is not going to be taken into account, and everything else that is done by all the people that are reading the papers and seeing the results, because I feel like it's my responsibility to make sure that their suffering is one of the many votes that gets transformed into research. It pains me because there is not an emphasis on how important that vote is. if anything, there's this sort of culture that for real reasons, there's sort of this element of distrust in, medical research, because there were some terrible researchers in the past. Terrible, terrible. And I think one of the things that is so critical to change is the support for that very thing, which is making sure that we get your vote as part of it and your representation into the research that is done. And it's one of the reasons why we have so much difficulty translating old research, because it was done on very specific types of people. And now it only applies to those very specific types of people and ends up being, useless. So that is one thing that if we could change, we could actually value you and your data, then maybe the tools in development would mean something to, our basic scientists, because they would understand what that data looks like and understand what can be collected, and then they can have the frame of mind to design experiments that we might actually be able to test in our lifetimes, without this tremendous 20-year gap between, balancing between clinical and basic. And I think we're all looking to close that, but until there is the realization of your data and that data being the most precious thing, on Earth besides you, it's not going to happen, because we're always losing it.
I'd like to bring you guys into the conversation, so if anyone has a question or a comment, and while we're waiting for Mike, you seem to want to say something, Mike.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on a couple of things that were said already, and that is, that obviously we all believe that the communication between our collective groups needs to be improved. And I think, like you say, Barry, it's rare to get a group of people together like this. SCI 2020 was a good example of when that first happened. And one of their missions was to make that happen more often. How can we improve communication? And I think that meeting, SCI 2020, was a success in that we are having this discussion now. And when I went back to my research center, we had a collective discussion there. And we're trying harder to change the way we do things. We're trying to communicate with all the different communities more. We're trying to effectively communicate with people with spinal cord injury. We're trying to communicate better with clinicians. And we're trying to use language that is more widely understood amongst all groups. So when we refer to translation, as scientists, that could be from a dish to an animal is translation. But there's a full spectrum that we need to appreciate. When we talk about research, like you were mentioning a few seconds ago, you're talking about clinical research, but there's also many shades of research. So we have to be clear in what we mean when we're describing some of these terms.
I want to add to that, just and I hope this doesn't sound like a commercial for Unite to Fight Paralysis, but I'm sorry, and I guess that's why we're here, or why I'm here. It's interesting to me that it's a challenge to explain what it is that we do at Unite to Fight Paralysis. And the genesis of this organization, the founding, was really around this symposium in many ways. And the idea of getting people together. Like I've said a couple of times, the people who research the injury and the people who have the injury, get them together in the same room talking, trying to understand one another. But everything else that this organization does is rooted in that same thing. So podcasts, some of you have been on our podcast, is this conversation between the community and the scientist. Unpack the science, unpack living with the injury. The scientific advisory board that we have is, yes, it's about funding science, but ultimately our vision really is we want the people who run the SCI foundations to be talking to the labs that they're funding and having a relationship Not just write a check, but getting feedback, talking to one another. Why are you doing this? What are you doing next? What do you need from us in the community? Our Cure Advocacy Network is another example where we've had success at passing funding legislation. And everybody always thinks of that as, oh, you got money. And I always say, no. I mean, we did get money, but the money's just a tool to get our people in conversation with your people so that we can dialogue together and try to close that gap. And so I think I'm glad you articulated that, because I think that's really, really critical. This idea of relationship and taking one another seriously, so you're not just blaming somebody, or they're not blaming you or us, or but actually taking each other seriously and deepening the relationship. Claudia.
I'm a wheels on the ground kind of girl when it comes to advocacy. I'm suing the city of New Orleans for not making a public library accessible. They went through some renovations and somehow they forgot that part. And I've had handicapped parking spaces designated around town. So I guess I'm wondering, what can we do as the people out here so that our voice is heard as individuals to help our community?
Who are you asking that to?
Yeah, everyone. Just whoever has the best answer. How can I as an individual become more involved?
Welcome aboard. Join. Get involved with one of the organizations. Get involved with Unite to Fight Paralysis. Get involved with the North American SCI Consortium, United Spinal. Get involved. Be part of that. And within those avenues, you can work hard and be a voice, and a louder voice. You could be organizing others. Welcome aboard.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think asking the question is the first. I almost made the comment earlier. I come across a lot of folks, particularly in the legislative advocacy as we've gone around the country, and there's often a trajectory. There's a lot of folks out there that are kind of left behind. I've gone to visit people in group homes and nursing homes that don't belong there. But then there are other folks who are still focused on themselves and focused on, we raise funds for our needs, or very, very localized. And then there are those folks who have looked outside of that and looked to expand their influence. And so, yes, join something. We, in our organization, are very committed to this idea that we need to become savvier. We need to become educated about this stuff so that we can have more effective advocacy, more strategic, to really be thinking about the closing of the gap between, when I started, to give you an example of trying to pass a bill in Minnesota, I was fixated on this idea that there's not enough funding. We need to increase the funding. But it didn't take me long to realize that's not the solution. If you have a system that's not working effectively, and to no one's blame individually, but the system itself, and you're pouring money into it, it's just going to, whatever inefficiencies it has are just going to be amplified. And so we need to get smarter about how we use our resources and how we engage. And that's why we do some of the things that we do, like this conference, is to help us get smarter about this. But the last thing I would say is I would harken back to the idea of relationships. Where you are, find people with SEIs, find researchers, find clinicians, begin to build relationships, begin to build an ecosystem around an effort towards we want to get better. At our advocacy, we want to get better recovery, we want to get better clinical outcomes, take your pick.
Okay,
add to that. So for me, it's all, some of my colleagues joke at me because I always use the word story. Okay, what's the story? I'm building the story, I'm pitching the story. But as a group, and I use a couple of analogies, because I worked in Alzheimer. I've just recently talked to a person who was heavily involved in the cystic fibrosis area. We have, as a community, particularly you folks out there, you gotta get the word out to the nation, to the, to everyone on the street, to say that spinal cord injury is something we as a nation have to deal with. For example, several years ago, I don't know how long ago, but I think if you ask someone who had cystic fibrosis, you say the word cystic fibrosis, and like, oh, what is that? Is that a problem? But now you say the word cystic fibrosis, people nod their head. Multiple sclerosis, right? 20 years ago, multiple sclerosis, well, it's some sort of a researcher knew, maybe a clinician knew. But now if you say multiple sclerosis to anyone on the street, they might not know everything about it, but they nod their heads like, yeah, that's a problem. So when I go out and talk to people, and I tell them, like, we're doing a technology for spinal cord. I'm also doing this technology for multiple sclerosis. A lot of them say, oh yeah, multiple sclerosis, I get it. I want you guys to get it out there so that when I also say spinal cord, they get, oh yeah, I got it. That's a problem that we have to solve, right? And that is the start of the story that I could help build. So, that's just something that I know you guys are doing, but by making it really prevalent out there, we as a nation appreciates that we need to solve this. Alzheimer's is a perfect example, right? People used to suffer, the elderly used to suffer, at home, in complete silence. Now, Alzheimer's is big name, right? Everyone recognizes it as a big issue. We need to do that for spinal cord.
We're kind of jumping into the next panel with the next thing I want to say, but as we'll talk about with some of the advocates that were involved in legislative efforts in Pennsylvania and Ohio, those guys have heard me describe what we do is tell a story to a legislator, and the story is your personal story, and I think of it as like sort of a boat full of a bunch of file folders, like the old metal file folder boxes, right? It's got all this logic in it. We give these one-sheeters and we give all this data, and we put all that stuff in the boat. The boat's the personal story. If you try to give the legislator just the data, you're throwing that file thing in the water, it's just going to sink to the bottom. You need to have something, a vessel to hold it in. And to your point, Ernest, there's probably not a legislator that I've met with, and I've met with hundreds of them in the last few years, when you tell them the cost of an injury to their state budget for medical assistance, because we are an expensive, as you all with an injury know, we're expensive people to the state. And their eyes bug out. They had no idea. It wasn't on their radar until you tell them and explain. And that's part of telling that story. The nut to crack to get it to where it's a household name, that's, we can build on that, but it's a good point. Another comment or question? Dennis.
There we go. Okay, thank you. If I may be so bold, this has been on my mind for a bit. So first, I'm going to make a comment that is not meant to diminish what I think are some important successes about SCA 2020, but there were some things that were a little frustrating. So what the meeting wasn't. And so a lot of what we're talking about was also brought up at that meeting of, it feels like something's kind of broken, and we're not talking about solutions to fix it. And one of the things that was good was we were trying to talk about research priorities, but identifying new research priorities didn't feel like it was solving some of the other issues that were brought up. Like if the researchers feel like they're working in silos, are we talking about solutions to that? if we're worried about a small market and industry is not coming in, are we talking about solutions to that? If we're talking about bringing in the community of people, SCI, and advocating, are we talking about solutions to that? So I want to be, if I may be bold and disruptive, put forth maybe a partial solution to a number of these issues. I think that the NIH could have a bigger role in solving these issues directly. So there is the SPARC consortium, the Stimulating Peripheral Activity to Relieve Conditions. That is a SPARC initiative. And the way it works is researchers will put in these grant proposals and they'll get into this consortium if their ideas are good and if what their research programmatic goals are in line with the SPARC programmatic goals. Once you're in, so the grant review process is different. It's not, usually what we're used to is, as researchers, you put in a grant, and then some months later it gets reviewed anonymously by a body of reviewers you don't get to talk to. They'll give you a review back. Some months after that you have a decision, yes or no, is it funded, and some comments. And then some months after that you can modify your plan and try again. This is a significant issue with stability in the research endeavor and time. But then you get the grant. Great, you've got money. But money doesn't solve all the problems. So with SPARC, there's a much faster turnaround. If the idea is looking good but it needs tweaking, they'll work with you on that. There's negotiation. So once you're in the consortium and they want to keep working with you, you're now working with the other investigators in the consortium. You're working with the program officers, right? And so if something is good but needs tweaking, we'll negotiate it. The budgets are negotiated, milestones are negotiated. Another aspect of it is some projects are hypothesis-driven, others are milestone-driven. So they want to see a timeline. They want to see that you're hitting milestones. This is an example of the kinds of things that the NIH can do. So they can do this. This can help with a number of issues with the researcher barriers. This also addresses another issue with the researcher barriers of working in silos. We're brought together in a consortium. There is an annual meeting. I could be talking to people that are working on wildly different things from my point of view, but under this consortium, we have overlap and we'll share ideas, and it can be very, very important for sharing ideas and forming collaborations. We formed some new collaborations we didn't expect. There are also cores that they'll support. So there are data repository, mapping, simulation, and so there are experts that maybe I'm not an expert. I'd come up with very fancy computer simulations, but I can feed data to that core, and another group can feed data, another group can feed data, and then that core is taking all these different data, and they can put together a pretty sophisticated simulation. So what I'm putting forth is there could be a model that's quite like that for spinal cord injury within NIH. So a consortium, and I realize that I'm talking from a researcher point of view, but there could be a core that helps us understand, that helps us work through regulatory issues, reimbursement issues, de-risking. How do we get something that's going to go to market, especially a small market, and how far can the NIH support that until it's something that would be a marketable device, especially with non-diluted funding? So there's a number of those researcher barriers. There's a number of project barriers. So another core could be if we're trying to recruit subjects. If you want to participate in a study, there's a central place to go. You would also be able to have a single, like a house, one house for interfacing with all of this and understand what's going on and have a say. You would have the opportunity in this kind of vision for being a part of the research process from beginning to end, and not just being a subject and not just trying to get going to the state to increase funding for something. There is something else, though, is that you don't go to the NIH and then tell them what to do with their programs. The better thing to do, if you want to be advocating, it may be to go to Congress and tell them what the NIH should be doing. So this is very bold, and I'm kind of shooting from the hip right now, but I would love to talk about some of these potential solutions and how much of that is actually solving some of the barriers, and what did I miss, and what do you think about that?
Well, first off, I just want to say thank you, Dennis, for, I mean, that was a lot you said. But the very last thing in particular, as you know, NIH was pretty explicit at the meeting that we're not changing anything. We're asking you to tell us what you think should happen. But even in response, we're not necessarily changing anything. And I mean, that's what I heard. And so my question to you was going to be, well, you're saying NIH has a lot of influence here, but how do we influence the process? And maybe you just said it, with influencing Congress. To the other point, I want to kind of introduce you to someone and also just ask him to make a comment as well. Ethan Perlstein is the new Chief Scientific Officer at the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. And the reason why I'm introducing you is because he was introduced to the world in a press release and described as a disruptor. And so I just wanted to throw back to you, Ethan, as you've listened to this conversation and the Reeve Foundation's plan and your hire was as a disruption. They want to invest a lot of money in taking things through translation, maybe things that are they're sort of sitting there on the edge of the pipe, or things that have yet to come that far. And I think it is a disruption. I think it's an idea that's worthy. So I just wanted to ask, how do you hear this coming from your background? We're new to STI, but not new to this problem in other communities.
So first off, hello everybody. On Monday will be 4 weeks on the job, so, but this is exactly how I like to operate coming from the startup world. Move fast and build things. So a lot of what I'm hearing is stuff I've heard a lot in my past life working in the rare disease community, where you have exactly the same kinds of stakeholders and the same kinds of challenges. But I think what I can offer at this moment is just letting everyone know maybe a little bit more about why I think I was brought to Reeve and what the vision is moving forward. And so in the release that came out a couple weeks ago, we talked about raising a $50 million venture philanthropy fund. And I think the concept of venture philanthropy in itself is a way to bridge a lot of these, or to knock down some of these barriers potentially, and really reveal synergies among these stakeholders. So nothing's been raised yet. The fundraising roadshow hasn't begun. That's what the next couple of months are for me, is to continue to talk to the community and understand that means researchers and community members, and understanding what are the best translation opportunities. We've been hearing a lot about great translation and great basic science today. We've been hearing from companies that have made the transition. And so I can't tell you that I've come up with a recipe yet. There is no magic solution yet, but I think that what Reeve is trying to do with this move is to say, we need to be able to not only deliver on the promise that is long overdue, but also let there be a mechanism for the community to participate in the upside. Because otherwise, if the baton is just passed to some big company, or whether it's a device company or a biotech company or a pharma company, you are in some ways losing control. And I think what a lot of patient-led organizations have realized with venture philanthropy is the opportunity to keep that accountability and also be able to enjoy the upside, so that if there is a financial return, then the foundation, the community can then use that as a way to make a more sustainable model for themselves, so they don't have to necessarily resort to the donation model anymore. So I think that's the long-term vision. And yeah, as I said, everything I've heard here are the challenges that are not unique to this community at all. And I think venture philanthropy is not, I'm not trying to sell that as some kind of magic bullet itself, but I think it does present a new opportunity to say, we can make a break with the past, we can decide that as a community we want to invest in certain opportunities, and we want to understand that if those opportunities do translate in the clinic, that there will be a reward, and that reward will be put to further iterations, right? Because if this $50 million fund is successful and it deploys capital and it seeds a bunch of discoveries and takes them to the clinic, there's no guarantee that any one of those is going to be the answer. So we're going to need to have proceeds from that to then invest in the next generation of technologies. And so I think the fund is not just about what's the most mature shovel-ready projects, but what are the most exciting projects that are incubating somewhere off in some corner in some lab, and understanding that with the right injection of capital, with absolutely with milestones, Is there a way that we can seed opportunities from the ground floor up? So anyone who wants to talk to me, I'm here the rest of the evening, fly out tomorrow morning, so I'd love to hear feedback, love to meet as many of you face-to-face as possible, and thanks, Matthew, for giving me a chance to introduce myself.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple of extra things going back to where this started, SEI 2020. One of the things that Lynn Jakeman said right up front was that we needed to not be good at just talking, but being good at listening. And so I think there wasn't enough time in some regards to discuss many of the things that everyone there wanted to talk about. And we maybe didn't get to hear everything that we wanted to listen to. And so in one regard, that meeting will be a success and continue to be a success if we keep discussions like this ongoing. I think part of what will make that a success is also addressing some of the things that meeting did not achieve. So maybe focusing, like was mentioned, on specific avenues that we need to focus on as priorities in future. Another that was mentioned by Lynn right up front was that the attendance of trainees at SEI 2020 was minimal. And that's something that it's good to see Unite to Fight Paralysis improving upon at this meeting, attracting trainees to not only be here but also present. And I think it's good for trainees to be here, not just to listen, but to learn about what they will need to do in future, because essentially they are replacing all the senior scientists that have an opinion and are doing work. And this entire community is going to help shepherd them in the appropriate direction as to what they need to be doing. I think that's an important discussion. It's important that they are involved with that discussion.
So I want to give some feedback to the various stakeholders here, because these are feedback directly from the street, right? I've been on the road for 4 weeks. I send pictures of myself in various cities to my family, so they know where I am. I have spent 2 days with my family in the last 3-4 weeks. I'm on the road. People are accepting, resonating with the story. Okay, I'll keep hitting the street every single week because I believe what we do is so important. Okay, I will find the money to do this. Okay, but I want to give you guys some feedback. One of the things right off this from the street, this is to the researchers out there. What investors appreciate there's risk. That's okay. They accept that there is risk. They accept the fact that not all the answers are answered. Okay, what they want is actually clarity. Okay. And in terms of the research space, one of the things that really resonated with investors, and my colleague Mark DePaul touched on it in his presentation, was the ability, what they really liked about Dr. Silver's work was the ability that the technology was validated by multiple laboratories around the world. And if you can have a new technology coming through that can be not repeated, but at least validated by different researchers, that's actually quite attractive to investors. Again, going to the story, that's a story they like to hear. Again, they appreciate there's risk. But if they say, Mark here has done something, Jerry has, also did something that supports what Mark does, or the NIH also, their lab has done something that, also supports it. Right? It gives some validity to the technology that an investor wants. The other thing I want to give you the feedback from the street is that they are willing to invest, but they don't want to be the only one out there, putting their money in. They want to work in a crowd. So if some of the foundations or some of the nonprofit is willing to invest a little bit, again, I'm not talking about $100 million. If they could see that the foundations are willing to invest in a particular technology, they feel better. A lot of investors said, "Oh, well, have you talked to the foundation? Are they investing?" Right? So, and they see foundations or some other sort of nonprofit invest in a technology, the investors feel more comfortable, and they're willing to then. We're not the only, investor A is like, I'm not the only crazy one out there, right? So a little bit like that. Sometimes, they look for these things when I hit the street.
One more question?
Sorry. Just following up to Ernest's point and to Matthew's earlier question to Michael. Just for a little bit of context, I did my PhD in Jerry Silver's lab, and I saw the birth of the nerve gen technology in about 2011. And then I saw the struggle over the next few years as they attempted to move that forward and get traction and getting investors interested in taking the next step. And what they heard over and over from people in commercialization and tech transfer was good ideas die all the time. And I think that their struggle and their persistence in moving it forward, and ultimately in Harold's pundit, the investor actually coming to Jerry, that was the ultimate way that things ended up moving forward. So I'm just wondering if Michael and possibly David, if you feel like you have the resources in actually making your discoveries visible to investors and how the advocacy groups could potentially facilitate that.
So if I could just touch from a preclinical perspective first, there are opportunities for us to learn how to move those things forward. I think quite often people that I've worked with very closely aren't aware that these exist, and they may not be even on their agenda as to pushing for that sort of thing. Me personally, I've kind of gone a little out of my way to find these people at times, both whether it's at the university or outside the university. So there's people there you can certainly speak to and consult with. You just sometimes have to search for them.
Yes, I think that's true of most places. That being said, though, it's quite a challenge to allot some of my time to go out and shill, because you got to make a story. You got to tell that story a lot. You got to practice that story. You got to convince some people. And, we didn't go to graduate school or medical school, residency to run a business, But we want to move things forward. So we do that, and we deal, personally, we deal with the lawyers and talk, and, all that stuff endlessly. And it is hard to quantify that amount of effort that goes into even just basic things. So it's a challenge. And I think what I've heard back from that community is, man, you clinicians are really hard to work with. And it's like, yeah, but you guys never deliver, That's why we're hard to work with, because we want something to work, not your pocketbook to increase in size. I could not care any less about that. And it's hard to fake that, and I usually can't. So it just comes down to the math and whether or not you can do the math and put it in front of them and say, are you ready yet or now or, So there isn't a lot of support to bridge that gap because, we are demanding, at least my colleagues and I are, and I think the community should be as well, because we've had a lot of trials fail, and a lot of money has gone into that. So I think if there were I think what Matthew's been talking about, how advocacy can fill some of that gap, I agree with, because there are so many missed connections. I think things could move, 50% faster if some of those connections were made in each community.
Was there over here? And then one last question, and then I think we'll probably...
Okay, I'll try to make this succinct. My thing here says I'm Jason from Montana, so that's who I am. And it says first-time attendee. So I am, maybe I'll show some of my ignorance here. My question up front is there an identifiable strategy to get to a cure? And the reason I asked that, so I'm 2 years out. This is the first attempt for me to get involved in advocacy. Attending this is my first conference. I did see the SCI 2020, sat through hours and hours and hours of video cast of that and tried to learn what I could. And there's a lot of smart people in this room. And this, to me, from what I've identified, Unite to Fight Paralysis seems to be like the best hope of having some sort of a strategy to collaborate with all the pieces of the puzzle. But is there something, so I also think of Claudia's question, right? We're here, we're motivated, some of us have time, some of us have resources, some of us have talents. Where can we fit into the puzzle? I also think of Kate's book, Don't Call It a Miracle, and where she cited the AIDS movement and what they were able to do to unify and hit the ground running as foot soldiers to get a cure there, right? So I guess my question ultimately is there some sort of a strategy? Is somebody working on a strategy to get us to that point? Otherwise, it seems like these things will repeat ad nauseum. And I don't know. It seems like a good place to ask the question. So.
That's an excellent question. And as soon as I turned from you, I was looking right at Corinne, who's been asking me for years. I used the term a while back, and others as well, this idea of a roadmap. What's the roadmap? And I'll be honest with you, I don't think there is a roadmap right now. And I think maybe even from the elements of this conversation and this conference and its evolution over time, there used to be more of just let's hear from the scientists what the next big thing is and what we should maybe pay attention to or what we should put our hope in or give our money to. I believe that's evolved over time because the field is changing. There are advances happening. There are maybe opportunities, but there are still some lagging fundamental systemic problems. And I think this conversation is, at this point, what I would say is, to the best of my ability, and I'll betray my ignorance, we are searching for that strategy. And I think we do understand that thank you for the kind words. I think the one thing that we understand at this organization is kind of what you said. I think we in the advocacy community have a role to play to be in between all the players. That diagram I threw up there is maybe the closest I would say we have to a strategy, that we as advocates need to be interceders between the various players and to make sure that the story that's being told is the story that will make a difference, whether it's a scientist or a clinician or a funder or a regulator or a payer, etc. I think that, and I'm open, I'm all ears. At this point, I think that's the strategy. I did make a comment yesterday about the FDA and CMS that I do believe that that's a place where we have been weak as an advocacy community broadly. We're focused so much on getting something happening, and we don't realize what's going to happen as that thing happens down the track. And so we have to mature our understanding of how to move things to reality for us. So we are trying to put all those pieces together. But I don't know that I can say there is a plan. But if anyone has it, there's one before you, Corinne, right here. And then we'll have to wrap it up. You and then Corinne, and we'll have to sort of continue the conversation.
Hey, everybody. My name's Jacob. I'm new to this season of my life, paralysis. It's been less than a year now. It's been less than a year now, and this is the first event that I've been to connect and to see what the community looks like from apparently all sides. That map that you had up there, it was win, 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 win. It doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of collaboration that can be had among intents. And not to oversimplify this, but on a philosophical sense, if I take a look at the world around me, there's two lenses that I use to observe it. First would be who benefits. That's what we were looking up there, is who benefits is how you connect the pieces. The second is what's their intent. The way that any of us find a pathway to the cure or find any sort of resolve in this torrential life is need investors. Well, those investors aren't investing out of the goodwill of mankind or paralysis or anything else. The gentleman that's second to the right up there, he's tried to put it as politely as he can. These men want to see the return of their money. I mean, any major pharmaceutical company, and if they're on the stock market, they have one obligation. It's not to patients, it's not to the goodwill of people that they're trying to serve, it's to their shareholders. It's to those, they have a damn near legal obligation to serve. And I don't know too much about philanthropy, but that's why that almost seems like part of the answer. So then if you have these organizations, they're saying this is what we're fighting for, are they the first donors? Are us out here that, what 66% of us aren't employed? Are we some of the first donors with the little money that we have? Where's that faith coming from? Where's that intent coming from? And then I actually just want to address, the third gentleman from the left with the tie. I'm a big fan of ties. So Kelly introduced me to this article about an open source platform that's being established right now. University of Alberta was one of the founding members, and two colleges out of California. And you were talking about all this lost data, this data that 20 years, and it seems like there's not that I'm a researcher or any sort of medical in the medical field at all, but it seems like a lot of this research just goes overlooked because it didn't have. They said 85% of the research goes unpublished because it's bad data. Well, what is bad data? It means that research is going to be duplicated over and over and over again in the world, and you're going to have these victims of research that hasn't been shared. That's really sad. You have a man that probably went to school because he wanted to help people. Not to oversimplify it, but I think that's what most of our intents were growing up. You ask somebody what they wanted to do growing up. Wanted to be a firefighter, wanted to be a police officer, wanted to be a doctor, wanted to be, but most people didn't say, I want to grow up and invest $1 million so that I can see profit on that at the expense of who? That's a sad story. But sad stories don't bring profit margins. Sad stories don't bring investors. It has to be a story that sounds good. So I don't know. I'd like to hear just a response on the open source platform, if that's as encouraging as the articles that I've read. And I'm ignorant. It seems encouraging to me.
Yeah, there are some good efforts right now, and I think that's a partial solution. Having a platform is part of the problem, and we've seen adoption of similar programs already on the clinical side that are helping tremendously, because if you're a new researcher, you can't afford super expensive software just to collect your data. So that is happening, and that is making a difference overall. I think the other issue is that even the collection and foresight and thought put into collection of that data is just not valued right now. It's not valued in terms of how people are paid what kind of grants you get. It's just that nobody has really put a lot of effort into making sure that we are as careful and as conscientious as we can be. And that's a scalable problem. We all collect the same data. It's the same everywhere. So.
What I want to add too is I mentioned, I think yesterday, one of the things that we do at United to Fight Paralysis is we've organized these phone meetings with the various scientists that are doing neuromodulation work. And on those calls over the last year and a half, which is again another example of this intercession, those scientists said we don't talk enough together. We don't, we read each other's publications, but we're not really in relationship enough, and we should be. And so we offered that up to say, well, we'll do the legwork to make it happen. Just be your administrative assistant. And one of the things that has come up a number of times on those calls is an open data source, where you can share data that has integrity, data that's comparable, that's coherent, because currently in all that research, it's not shareable really or coherent. It's not measured in the same buckets. So that's, and I was thinking of this in relation to, Jason, your earlier question, like this is a very complex problem, right? And there's all these big issues going on, and maybe one way to answer your question of what's the strategy is there are these little micro strategies. Like we understand there's a problem here, there's a gap to fill, let's fill that gap. And that's what, and it's not just us, there are other entities. Obviously, Reeve is addressing one thing with Ethan's comment. The North American SCI Consortium is a response to those gaps. And so it is kind of a micro strategy to a macro problem, or micro strategies to macro problem. If that makes sense. Corinne, last, and then we're going to have to end it and then move to our Advocacy Network panel. So you guys make your way up here, or towards here. Corinne.
2 points. I'm going to try and make it short, but it's not my strength, so
you can.
I apologize. I think that all this discussion will only become relevant when we, especially the discussion about a strategy, it will become relevant when we pick up a goal, a target, and that target should be focused enough to be actually actionable. And I wonder, we are speaking about open data, I wonder what the value could be, might be, of a virtual network, a multifunctional virtual network of scientists, people, organizations, working, starting from one target. Let's say regeneration or recovery of a certain function. And then derive a strategy and a roadmap from there, rather than push an existing technology to get somewhere. I know this is a bit, this is a dream, and who is paying for those people? How do you get the capacity to work on those virtual teams? But that's just the way I see it. So that's one point. Another point, because then we could identify the gaps and the accelerators from various viewpoints, taking into account the various capabilities of people and the standpoint from the market, from the clinicians, etc. My second point is about the NIH. You said, Matthew, that you heard Jane say the purpose was not to change anything. I heard her say that the purpose was not to do things as they used to be done. So I was wondering, when are we going to get some feedback to all this information that they received, and how can we push so that some of those, maybe hundreds of thousands of proposals, be implemented? I do agree that the community really should not count on others. We have to do things, we have to work. But I think some help from the NIH would also be welcome, and from some other institutions, of course.
Well, to your one question about NIH, and I didn't mean it in a disparaging way, but I remember what I heard was that the original idea was to ask the community, what do you see that needs to change? What disruptions need to happen over the next decade to get where we all want to get, and that NIH wasn't dictating that, and the message was don't just respond by saying, well, you should do this. You know, that the whole community is going to say, well, NIH, you should do this, you should change that. That's what I meant to say.
No, for sure. It means
Yeah.
they are not going to change everything.
Yeah, and in some sense, maybe it's similar to your last point, which is we need to make changes instead of look for others to make those changes for us. Anybody know when NIH is supposed to report back? Anybody? I guess, no? Okay.
In terms of collecting data that's otherwise discarded, yeah, I think there's been a big push in recent years and a lot of support from scientists. I think previously maybe people were a little concerned about sharing data that they weren't comfortable with and they thought were negative data. And I think more progressively we're getting a lot better at looking at all the data as simply just data. There's not positive and negative data, it's all informing us of something. So when it doesn't work the way we expected it to, we can still learn from that as to why didn't it? Do we have a therapy that's relevant for some people only? And that's important to know. So I think the collection of all this data is going to be very valuable in the future, and I think we're already seeing how we'll start to learn a lot more about people with injury, the models we use, and how treatments can be better developed. Oh. In some ways, I'm in favor of that. I think in some ways that is already developing. I think the effort that Matthew and Unite to Fight Paralysis has had in getting people from different states to come together. Even just in Pennsylvania, I've been introduced to so many new people and new communities just in my state, thanks to the efforts and the advocacy support for what we do. I've met many more new people, and I think even state by state we'll start to see that sort of network occur, and hopefully then it'll be better integrated throughout the US and even globally.
Thank you all. Appreciate it. And we're going to transition to the next panel. And that's actually, thank you. That's actually a really, sorry. That's a really good segue because, and I sort of planned this way that, is that enough room? Got it. Relative to your question, Corinne, and also to the idea of what's the strategy, what's the plan, one of those plans for us has been in order to influence, identify gaps in the research process and increase the influence the community can have over research targets, priorities, outcomes, is to initiate this, what we call the Cure Advocacy Network. Come on up, y'all. Which was to pass funding for SCI research, but more importantly, to place people from the community at the decision-making table to influence the larger process. And again, that's a micro strategy for a macro problem. So I asked these folks to come up. And do we need another chair? There's one over there. And to share a little bit about their experience in doing just that. Thanks, Jeni. No, I'm just hang here. So first off, I'm gonna holler out to you in a minute. Introduce yourselves first. Let's go across quick, and then we'll kind of jump into tell them a little bit about your experience.
My name's Kate Chalfin from Pennsylvania. Is that right up in there? Kate Chalfin from Pennsylvania.
Jake Chalfin from Pennsylvania. This is my second conference, and thrilled to be here.
My name's Allie Leatherman. I'm from Toledo, Ohio.
I'm sure this is working. No?
You want to use this one?
I'm Peter Nowell from Columbus, Ohio.
Jeni Belt, Toledo, Ohio.
So just for those of you who may not be aware, in October of 2018, we passed $1 million appropriation in the state of Pennsylvania to go specifically to spinal cord injury research, and mandated that people from the SCI community, people who have an injury or family member of an injury, along with clinicians, researchers, would be placed on an advisory board to advise how that money is spent and distributed. In July of 2019, we passed a $3 million earmark, as they refer to it, not appropriation, for spinal cord injury research. Also, we didn't have that stipulation written into the 3 sentences in the budget, but we will be meeting soon with the Office of Higher Education that will distribute that $3 million with folks from the community and clinicians and scientists together to talk about how that money would be allocated. So first off, I want to ask each of you, most everybody in our experience doing this hasn't been to the Capitol, most everybody hasn't lobbied for a particular issue. So I want to just open it up to whoever wants to respond, to just tell a little bit of the experience of going to the Capitol, talking to legislators, telling the story to influence policy.
But just the first thing I want to say before I even answer that question is, for those of you in the room that aren't doctors or research scientists or don't have a ton of money but have a burning desire to do something, what we're about to talk about is exactly what you could potentially do. You don't have to have any skills, you don't have to have any experience, just a desire. And this is one of the best ways that you can create change. And hopefully you guys can learn from what we've done. And none of us had ever done it before. We kind of learned as we went along, failed until we didn't. And of course, Unite to Fight and Matthew were there to give us guidance and direct us when we needed it. And so, yes, going to legislature was new for myself and my wife Kate and our small group of Pennsylvania advocates, and we were a very small group. So strength in numbers is great, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. A small group of dedicated people can be very effective. And I think initially I was a little intimidated talking to senators and House of Representative members, and we never really got to talk to the governor to the end, so that wasn't a problem. But after a while, you realize they're just people like you and I, and you don't need to put them on a pedestal. And then after even a little bit longer of a while, you realize that some of them really don't even deserve to be there. They're kind of not that good anyways. And the whole issue with government makes sense, like how not much gets done sometimes. And then you get a lot of confidence when you realize, hey, wait a minute, these guys aren't any smarter than we are. And then all of a sudden you can talk to them on a level playing field. But there's some strategy that goes into it. And Unite to Fight has really helped us. And we couldn't have done it without Unite to Fight. And so we're really thrilled. It's only $1 million, it's not $3 million, but it's something to build on, and we're stoked. And it's not just our 2 states. How many states in total have accomplished this?
Well, Minnesota started. Kate and Bruce, Kate, who also wrote Don't Call It a Miracle, was referenced earlier. Kate, you back there? Kate and Bruce and Chet Moritz at Washington got an appropriation, lost the appropriation, but they're going to go back this year and try to get it back. And then Pennsylvania, Ohio. John, raise your hand. We just introduced a $10 million bill in Wisconsin. Ask of $10 million. I kind of doubt we're going to get 10, but that's in process. And in fact, this coming week, we're going to hit the Capitol again, full day meetings with legislators to push that forward. So yeah, whatever that is. Yeah.
I'll just echo what Jake said. I started this journey because I read Kate's book, Don't Call It a Miracle, and when I got to the end of the book and she talked about what we could do to help, I just sent an email to the address that she had listed at the end of the book, and it happened to go to Matthew. I asked if there was anything happening in Pennsylvania, having no idea, what was involved, and he said, yes, actually, there's a few of us meeting at Drexel, next month, and so that's how I got rolling. And just to echo also what Matthew said earlier, once you start meeting with representatives and senators, and we have the fact sheets and you're trying to memorize how many people in PA have spinal cord injuries, how much money it costs, what it really came down to for us was our personal story, Jake's personal story, our other advocates. And even if the representatives didn't really feel like they wanted to help us, a lot of them would say, you should talk to this person or you should talk to that person. And they eventually put us in contact with the senator or representative who cared about the issue. In the end, for us, that was a representative named Alex Charlton who had a daughter who was born with a spinal cord injury. And then he became our advocate. And that was all we really needed, was our personal story to connect with the right person. So it really is about human connection in the end, even though it's kind of a mess to get there.
And it took us about 2 years, and Alex Charlton was in the House of Representatives the whole time with this incredible story that was relatable to us and ours to his, but we just never connected, and it just took that long. When we finally made the connection, it was incredible. So you never know. You got to keep meeting people, and eventually you'll find your inside warrior that'll help you really make a big advance in the bill.
Just from
Peter, go ahead.
From an Ohio perspective, I would just kind of echo the comments that both Jake and Kate have made. That there's a common perception that these people are kind of super people, and really they're not. They're just like you and me. And I think, as Jake said, there's some questions about whether some of them should even be there. But it's really a numbers game. I'm an engineer, and to me, you put the facts together and you present it to somebody, and it's obvious, right? They're going to support it. Well, no, it's not quite as simple as that. And just as the previous panel or discussion, there's the argument that you have to have, the numbers and all that, and you have to have that. But it's really a left brain, right brain kind of thing. And if you don't make the emotional connection at some level, then it's really not going to go anywhere. How you make that emotional connection is debatable, because I did a lot of research and looked at all the legislators and what kind of bills they'd pass, how many bills they'd pass, and how I thought that they might be kind of supportive of our cause. It was basically a whole waste of time, because the people that we did get traction with kind of came out of left field. As for instance, we started this process for Ohio the previous year. We were kind of late in the game, and I met with my personal senator, and she gave me about 5 minutes, and then she had to rush off to some other task, and she handed us over to the aide. So we said our story, and we kind of walked out of there thinking, well, that's a huge waste of time, that's not going anywhere. And then we reconnected this year, and she remembered us. And she actually became one of our most strongest supporters. So don't dismiss anything as being a write-off. You never know where you've made that connection. And to the point that you guys made, if you can get a champion, someone that does connect for whatever reason, that's huge. How you get there, how you make those connections, leverage. It's the same as business. Leverage all those network connections. You know, people that you know through your social groups, through church, whatever. Do you know a representative? Do you know a senator? You know, can you make an introduction? You know, if we can get those personal connections, don't be shy about again making connections. Everything can help. And it's a lot of hard work, you know. It's a numbers game, you know. How many did we see? We're about 48 interviews over 3 days. It's some of them didn't bear fruit, maybe, but the more people that hear about it, when somebody else says, "Hey, you know, I saw this group coming and talking about spinal cord research," oh yeah, I mean, yeah, I've heard about that. So. Again, as the previous presenters were saying, the more people that can connect and have at least heard about it, you know, the better chances. So, just a few thoughts.
Thanks, Peter. I want you to, and maybe Jeni, you start by describing, I think probably the most critical part of getting the passage in Ohio started in a bar in Toledo.
Why do you have to bring up the bar, Matthew?
Meeting room. Maybe you could just set the stage for telling that story.
Sure. So my first connection to United to Fight Paralysis was attending the 2016 Work to Walk conference, which was sort of a desperate effort for me to figure out how to help my best friend who had been paralyzed in January of that year. And Matthew did the Conestoga Wagon Trail meets NASCAR about the cure and how to find it, and asked what people were interested in and what their talents are. And I'm a lawyer by trade, so when he said advocacy, that resonated with me. Meanwhile, we were finding our connections in Toledo of people who were similarly situated. So we were all about 12 deep today because we formed a social group that all happens to have something in common that we wish we didn't. So at the same time that was happening, I was reporting to the group that I had met this really cool guy who's an advocate and wants us to get something going. Our group meets monthly. Matthew came to the meeting. He and I met with one of my colleagues who used to be in the legislature who said, "Oh, you want to talk to so-and-so?" So we were fortunate enough to get the Senate Majority Leader, Randy Gardner, to come to one of our monthly meetings. And I had given him the fact sheet. I had given him an article that particularly resonated with me, and he had read the fact sheet and he had read the article. He asked a lot of pointed questions. He took homework away with him, and he cried. So, I mean, he was definitely moved by what everyone had to say. He said he only had 20 minutes for us, and I think he stayed for about an hour, listened to everyone's story. And away we went. We did do the legwork. We went down to Columbus twice, over 2 days once and 3 days the second time. We traveled with a bunch of people from Toledo and some people from Columbus. And, that certainly helped. But we connected with the right person, like you said, and they became our champion. And so then it was just kind of seeing it over the finish line.
Yeah, to me the striking thing was you sort of said it. It was a table of people, dozen or so, right? Everybody went around and told their story, and then it was his time to speak, and it wasn't 30 seconds before he started tearing up and talking about his kids, and left that room saying, "I'm going to go back and do the best I can for you to make something happen." Then he got plucked to be the no longer the Senate Majority Leader, and we thought we'd lost, but he became the chair of higher education, and he actually put it in the budget for the governor.
And interestingly, his story, he really connected with us, not because he has a family member or a child with a spinal cord injury. He was just able to empathize with the challenges because everyone spoke so eloquently, and in some cases appropriately, desperately about what we're asking for.
Yeah. Allie?
In my experience with going down to Columbus, I mean, it helped me on a mental level also. I mean, coming at you from a C6, C7 quad, I mean, going in there, and I mean, there's these big wigs that have these books on their desk that you're wondering why they're even reading them in the first place, and they're cold seeming, and they're just not I expected it to be kind of like roses and happy, and we're going to like pass this bill and we're going to be famous and it's going to be so cool. And it was nothing like that. But what helped the most was just realizing, like what they said, these are just people. So when you were able to break it down that this could happen to any of us at any time for a list of stupid, silly, awful reasons, that once that started resonating with these people, then we were fortunate to get Randy on board. And I mean, it was just it helped me embrace my injury a lot more. It helped me accept my injury a lot more. I'm very comfortable explaining it to people now. I'm not embarrassed. I'm not ashamed. I'm proud of what we're doing. It's something tangible, and it's delivered me and everyone in my city and in your city, Pete, like, hope. I mean, we did something. It's always been this message that, you're hurt, you're injured, there's nothing you can do, have fun in your little wheelchair, your life's gonna suck, see you later. But that's not true. I mean, what Unite to Fight Paralysis is doing is changing that narrative, and that's a really powerful thing. And it's really cool that we're all able to be a part of that. And I mean, I want to go back down there. I thought it was kind of fun, honestly. But
Well, we might have that chance.
Yeah, one thing that actually surprised me was the positive reception that we got. I mean, I mentioned the number of meetings that we had, and I think every single one of them was positive. It's just a degree of positivity. I mean, nobody kicked us out and said, sorry, that's not something I don't support. I mean, the logic we had, the presentation that we made, who could reject that? It was just a case of finding the champion who was really going to take it over the cliff, kind of speaking. But everybody was supportive.
I'd like to skip ahead to, now that we've got the money, it's not just about the money, and it wasn't just the effort, and our effort's not over yet. The work, now that the money has been allocated, has really just begun, because part of, at least in the bill that we created with Matthew's genius, it creates a board of appointed people with stake in the outcome. So it's a 6-member board.
Bigger, it's more than that.
It's a 6 to 8 member board that is created to review research grant proposals and then distribute the money as best seen fit. And so there's neuroscientists on the board. I'm on the board as a representative from the community, living with an injury. There's parents on the board. There's rehab specialists on the board. So people with their own expert perspective from every side of the SCI issue are on this board, and it's our hope that with this brain talent we can sift through all the proposals and pick the very best ones that are most relevant for us and also have maybe the most potential to become real and something that our community can benefit from, hopefully in the near future, or at least start a snowball rolling. So it's not just about the money, it's how we're going to allocate that money, which I think makes this very special. We're not just asking for a handout, we're creating change with that money.
we're asking for a hand in it.
That's
I mean,
right.
And we all, every one of us in this room, we all need a little push sometimes. I think we all empathize with that statement, and that is ultimately the coolest part about what we're doing. I mean, we're pushing each other. I mean, the peer connections that I've made as a result of Unite to Fight Paralysis and SCI Connect, I mean, that arguably changed my life. I mean, it caused a total 180 that I chose to start engaging in the community and turning this awful thing into something that is, now a positive. I mean, we all made this huge road trip, an hour and a half away from home. We're all in the same hotel. We had a great time last night, just like we do at every meeting with the, it's a community. It's a really powerful thing. And I would highly encourage any of you in any other state that doesn't already have their bill in motion, do it. Go down there. It is not, these are just people, and they work for us. I mean, we're voting these boobs in there. So it's, far time that they're doing something that directly benefits us. And that's your mind is the most powerful thing. Not my legs, not my hands, certainly not my bowel or bladder. but it's your mind, it's your voice, and it's something that can captivate people and change perception as long as their eyes are open to it. And they're already staring at the wheelchair, so why not take advantage of every second you can have to be in front of people to change the game up?
I can tell you, when Allie's been into a senator's office, they're going to remember her.
I want to add also, I mean, to both of you, but Jake, the way you described, because of those advisory boards, I believe, in Minnesota and Washington in particular, as a result of these funding mechanisms, by the end of this year, 60 people will have had an intervention that would not have existed. David Darrow's study is 11 of those people. Mayo stem cell clinic, stem cell trial in the chronic injury will take 10 people by the end of this year. Chet Moritz's work at University of Washington. These were all funded by these efforts, and I'm a strong believer that it's because the community voice had a hand in the process and was saying, well, where is this going now? What is this going to mean? Not to say that we did in Minnesota particularly, we funded several basic science questions, but it was always asking this driver, how do we move it forward? Where do you go next? What's your plan? And that's because the community was at the table. I want to get some questions from you, and I also want to quickly, if Jake would take the mic first. Jake waved to everybody in the green shirt in the back. Jake is our Cure Advocacy Network manager. Jake's the guy who I think wasn't my genius. These ideas were, I'm just standing on the shoulders of other people, but Jake was really behind a lot of the legwork to make this happen. And so I just want to give Jake, I want you to point him out because for those of you who this piques your interest, whoever you are, wherever you're from, scientist, community member, talk to Jake if you have an idea for where you live. So Jake, I want you to just say.
Before Jake jumps in, I just want to say I should have mentioned him earlier when I was speaking highly of Matthew. Jake was absolutely very instrumental in the Pennsylvania bill getting passed. Like I said, we had a small group of advocates, and we're all very busy people, and if we're not dealing with our own SEI complications, we have day jobs, and we weren't friends beforehand, so our lives are completely unrelated and not intertwined, and it's quite an effort to connect on phone calls, which we would have to do on a regular basis to stay organized. And we also needed information from the research community. And Jake Beckstrom was the glue that kept our small advocacy group on track and made sure that our scheduled calls happened when they were supposed to, and made sure he interfaced with some of these research institutions that we just didn't have the time or the expertise to do so. So without Jake and his glue, we wouldn't have been able to do what we did. So go ahead.
Well, thank you for those kind words. I've been doing this. I came to U2FP about 1.5 years ago. Before that, I was in environmental law looking for a job as a lawyer, and then Matthew came to me and he's like, you and your law and policy background, and I'm affected by SCI, so I was like, yes, please, I want to join. And I came into Pennsylvania, and the bill had already been introduced. I didn't start that process, but I came in about halfway through, and my role is to help schedule meetings with these advocates who have day jobs and everything. I'll schedule meetings with the legislatures, the legislative offices, and get the whole day planned, and also schedule the monthly calls with everyone to keep everyone on the same page, make sure we know what our strategy is moving forward, our talking points, who we're going to meet with, who we should stay away from, things like that. And what else was I going to say? Oh, another cool thing, you touched the base about the advisory board. Another cool thing that I think is happening with these states is that it's like, okay, $1 million. What can we do with $1 million? But that $1 million is for one legislative session that lasts for like 2 years. In that next legislative session, they're going to do another budget, and we're going to ask for more than $1 million, more than $3 million in Ohio. We're going to keep this funding mechanism growing every single legislative session, and we're going to keep going back every year, and not just to Pennsylvania and Ohio. I see all these name tags with all these different states on these name tags, and we want to expand to as many states as we can. We're working in Wisconsin now. We're soon hopefully going to be moving out to Colorado, talking about Texas. We want to go to, this is the Cure Advocacy Network. We want to create a network of states with this same funding mechanism, same advisory board mechanism, and just grow it onto a national level. So please, if you guys have any inkling of like, what can I do, please reach out to me, connect with me. My business card is on the U2FP table out there. Reach out to me, because I'd love to get you guys on board and, make this happen in as many states as possible.
Thanks, Jake. Question, anybody? Sasha? Oh, sorry.
I want to applaud you all wholeheartedly, coming from the Commonwealth of Kentucky. We have, back in 1999, Christopher Reeve, when he was still alive, came and helped us advocate for our own speeding and drug driving funds. And we actually, that's why I moved from Paris, France to Lexington, Kentucky, a real major lifestyle change, because of the fact that we had money that was generated from speeding and drug driving tickets that went towards research for preliminary studies that you couldn't necessarily get from NIH. My point being is this, is that was great. Guess what? The law is being reneged now. We don't have the money we used to have. They've allocated to other things. Why? Because we were advocates, and we still are advocates, but we didn't have, like you said, the next handing off the baton. Who's going to keep carrying that on? And we're left showing them the evidence that we have from our studies, and they're like, well, sorry, but we need to build roads. And we are a very poor state, Commonwealth, as are others. This is what I love about this, is because I started the Kentucky Congress on spinal cord injury because I was pissed off, that restaurants were inaccessible. And just by that, I herded a bunch of cats. I mean, you know what it's like to get disabled individuals all together for a common cause. But once they got the flavor that you all have, it's almost like it's a feed forward. Because when you start to get results, it makes you want to do more. But on the other hand, and I don't want to see this, if you let it go, it could blow up in your face. And that's the part that we have as advocates. Keep pushing, because once we got it, we don't pat ourselves on the back. We do more money. We do more advocacy. And so I wanted to make sure that, number one, you're applauded, but that we don't stop the efforts.
Thanks, Sasha.
Hi, I'm Ann Bryden with Case Western, and I think my comment relates more to different tools that we should be considering for advocacy, for kind of strengthening the great work that you have already done. One element that I think is a big part of that, but has been pretty absent in I think our conversations the past 2 days, has to do with human rights and the idea of social justice, and kind of using those terms and those concepts to bring things forward with accessing the technologies and treatments and interventions that people are so wanting and needing. There are some human rights instruments that are provided by the United Nations, and there's one in particular, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Within that UN document, there's actually Article 15 that relates directly to a right to science. So the right to science is actually not just the right to the benefits of scientific progress that's funded by research that our government funds, but also it's the government's responsibility to ensure that these results are disseminated. And that is an article that hasn't been well articulated, generally speaking, and there are efforts at the UN level right now, broadly related to human rights, to better articulate that. They're coming out with a general comment sometime in 2020 to better define the human right to science. So I think that could be potentially a game changer for a lot of the work that we're trying to do. I also think that there's other resources. There's the Science and Human Rights Coalition, which is part of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and they do a lot of really good work on policy. I've attended a meeting at AAAS that really talked about some kind of tangible ways to engage in policy, much of what you've already spoken about today. But I guess my question for the group, or just something for us to chew on, is whether or not we can just kind of think about these things, the ideas of accessing what we need in terms of human rights, and what are the expectations of us as a spinal cord injury community to use that to bring things further.
I want to, Anne, thank you for that, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I heard you present some of that information earlier in the year, and have read some about that. And just to let you know, from me, that's a driver. Those words, social justice, looking more broadly at the issues. It's interesting to me how many legislators, but actually more than legislators, aides to legislators, have said to us, to me, when I try to explain to them or I assume that they don't understand that scientists are not necessarily, all of them, in the best relationship with the people they're researching. Like, they don't maybe not know them, or don't fully appreciate what it is that they're researching from our perspective. And many, an aide in particular, and some legislators have said, oh, we see that all the time in every issue, that the people that you're trying to help are not in the room here in making policy or making decisions or setting high-level strategy. And so to your point, for instance, I think of in Minnesota, what we started in Minnesota was a research funding mechanism. And in doing that was a lot of community organizing. Since the bill was passed, the $1 million in 2015, $6 million in 2017, last year there were 2 bills introduced by the same people. One was for PCA care in response to, can you get forgiven tuition as policy to entice more people into that field? And the other was a $1 million appropriation for activity-based exercise. Those came in a direct response to this kind of activity from the community to see what was possible. And we're already talking about that in Ohio, like how do we move that to the next stage? Because these are all interrelated problems. It's all part of one large ecosystem that we're all a part of. So thank you for bringing that up. Oh, it's time. Another question or comment? Kim?
Hi, Matthew and everyone on the panel. I just want to really applaud you. I've done advocacy work for all of my career. I'm the Director of Public Policy at the Christopher and Dana Ree Foundation, and what you've done really is extraordinary, and I want to really commend anyone to get involved on the state level. If anyone is interested in participating at the federal level, we run a similar program called the Regional Champions Program at the Ree Foundation. So if anyone is interested in advocating for increased federal funds at NIH, DOD, engaging more at the FDA, access to care, access to improved therapies, and to technology, to your wheelchair accessories, complex rehab technology, improving air travel for people living with disabilities. Those are some of the federal issues we're working on. So if you're interested in being involved in that, my goal would be to have an individual in every single congressional district. And I welcome anyone to talk to me if you want more information.
Thanks, Kim. And I think that's a great, also important, it reminds me of something that we didn't mention is, we're trying to keep pace right now with the state programs we have, but we've already begun the conversations right now, especially between Minnesota Office of Higher Education and Ohio Higher Education. We want to create a larger consortium amongst the states. There are now, I think it's 15 states now, and some of them are at risk of losing funding. Some have lost funding. But the next step, the next stage is to amplify. How do we connect and collaborate across these state entities for this funding, because it only strengthens the effectiveness of it. So we're looking at building not only just passing bills and creating those state mechanisms, but actually building a network from amongst them. And long-term strategy, we're not even, just think about it, is at what point do we turn to the federal level and say, look, we've had some success at the state level, we've created X amount of dollars, now you should pay attention. And now the federal government should do something about this and pick it up because you see it's working. So, thanks. Well, thanks. I want to applaud you all, and John, wave again, in Wisconsin, for saying yes, and for showing up, and for telling your stories, and for hanging with it when it was a slog, and long periods, gaps in Ohio of like, wait, what's happening? We don't know what's going on. Because once you deliver it to the legislature, they're going to do what they're going to do with it. And sort of you lose, it's not like you have total control. And so it was a long, difficult process, even though we did it quicker than you're supposed to. The average state bill is supposed to take 6 years to pass. We did it a lot less than that in PA and Ohio. Yep. But that's because of you guys, so thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. And then thank you all for being here this weekend. We so appreciate you coming out and participating, asking questions, making comments, talking with each other. I really do believe that is a part of the strategy, that we meet together, we intersect, we take each other seriously, and we begin to build relationships that actually matter to the outcomes that we seek. And again, thank you to our sponsors, without whom we would not be able to do this, but we would not be able to do it if you didn't come. And we also recognize, with so many people who have a spinal cord injury, to come, that's no easy feat, as you all know. We had a lot of cancellations in the last couple of weeks. Many people with spinal cord injuries for spinal cord injury stuff. That's a reality. And so we very much appreciate the sacrifice you made to travel here and be here with us to do this. I'll say it one more time. We do have an event survey. Please go to the Who app and complete it, because we love to hear from you. And thank you. Thank you for being here. And yeah, we're going to go meet. Yeah. Okay. And happy trails home. Stay in touch with us. Sign up for our newsletters if you haven't already. I think you have, because you registered for this conference. And bless you all.